Well, dear friends, I've been asked to speak about Century of Light, which is this book. I don't know whether you've all read it yet. It's not the easiest of books to read, but I think it's very important for Baha'is to read so that we understand more clearly what happened in the 20th century and can also get a clearer idea of what is before us in the 21st century. It begins with, I'll start off with two things. I want to read the foreword, which is by the House of Justice, and then the little introduction to give you a basic idea of what the book's about. The rest of the book, of course, isn't by the House of Justice. It's written for the House of Justice. And the House of Justice read it very carefully in session and out of session and went through it before it recommended to the friends to read. Now the foreword, which is by the House of Justice, says, the conclusion of the 20th century provides Baha'is with a unique vantage point. During the past 100 years, our world underwent changes far more profound than any in its preceding history. Changes that are, for the most part, little understood by the present generation. These same 100 years saw the Baha'i cause emerge from obscurity, demonstrating on a global scale the unifying power with which its divine origin has endowed it. As the century drew to its close, the convergence of these two historical developments became increasingly apparent. The Century of Light, prepared under our supervision, reviews these two processes and the relationship between them in the context of the Baha'i teachings. We commend it to the thoughtful study of the friends in the confidence that the perspectives it opens up will prove both spiritually enriching and of practical help in sharing with others the challenging implications of the revelation brought by Baha'u'llah. So that's the introduction by the House of Justice. Then it begins. The 20th century, the most turbulent in the history of the human race, has reached its end. Dismayed by the deepening moral and social chaos that marked its course, the generality of the world's peoples are eager to leave behind them the memories of the suffering that these decades brought with them. No matter how frail the foundations of confidence in the future may seem, no matter how great the dangers looming on the horizon, humanity appears desperate to believe that through some fortuitous conjunction of circumstances, it will nevertheless be possible to bend the conditions of human life into conformity with prevailing human desires. In the light of the teachings of Baha'u'llah, such hopes are not merely illusory, but miss entirely the nature and meaning of the great turning point through which our world has passed in these crucial 100 years. Only as humanity comes to understand the implications of what occurred during this period of history will it be able to meet the challenges that lie ahead. The value of the contribution we as Baha'is can make to this process demands that we ourselves grasp the significance of the historic transformation wrought by the 20th century. What makes this insight possible for us is the light shed by the rising sun of Baha'u'llah's revelation and the influence it has come to exercise in human affairs. It is this opportunity that the following pages address. Now it's worth reading from time to time books written either in the 19th century or in the early 20th century to have some feeling of how people looked at things and to realize how very different a world it was from the world we're used to now. It's a very short time. I had a book of history at home, which I've now given to my son. which was written during the time of Edward VII, which is not quite as bad as the Victorian age. And there's a nice chapter on it about Samoa, and it refers to Malietoa Taunamawhili I, and the condition in Samoa and the internecine fighting going on there, and the fact that Western Samoa, of course, was a colony of Germany, and the Americans were in the other part of Samoa. All this thing happening so recently. I mean, his son is Malietoa Taunamawhili II. But such a different world. The Samoans were known then as the Irish of the Pacific. As we tend sometimes to think of the peoples of this world as being nice and peaceful until the perfidious Westerners went there, but they were also rather bloodthirsty human beings too. In almost every country, you read the history, and it's a history of chaos and of war and struggle, almost unending. What happened in the 20th century, in the 19th century, which gave people great hope? There were wars then, but there'd been peace for a long time. The intensity of belief in religion was in many ways dying out. Materialism was rising. Prosperity was rising. There was great power centered in the governors of the European countries, and a strange relationship between them. They were not only very powerful monarchs, the Tsar of Russia, the Emperor of Germany, the Emperor of France, the Queen Victoria, but most of them were related to one another. They went to one another on holiday. And they looked upon Europe, as it were, as their playground, you might say. And yet there was this tension of possible war breaking out. Now, they even had great hopes of peace. I think the Tsar was one of the very eager proponents of peace in the world. What they missed was the underlying uncertainty, the underlying unhealthiness of the societies with which they were dealing throughout the world. You read Dickens and you get an idea of the sad condition of the lower classes in this country. There were similar conditions in others. The vast part of the world was very primitive. In the same history book you see photographs of what are now big cities like Melbourne and other parts of the world, which were then tiny little towns. The world was mostly, the civilized world you might say, was mostly Europe, with the United States some way, a little way behind. So it was a world that wasn't yet ripe to overcome the prejudices which divided its peoples. What has happened in the 20th century is really the destruction of the prejudices, of the iniquities which divided people. And it's happened rather in the way that a boil bursts. The 20th century has been a century of incredible suffering, of terrible misbehavior by human beings. But it's very interesting background to these activities. There were strange theories grew up. For example, Nazism isn't just a nasty tyranny which grew up in Europe. It was founded in the concept of eugenics, that as you breed racehorses, you can breed human beings. And obviously, therefore, if you want a perfect world, you breed perfect human beings to rule it. Hence the German concept of the Herrenvolk, the master race. And, in necessary, you obliterate undesirable races. And from the Nazi point of view, Jews and gypsies and others. It's a cold-blooded treatment of human beings as if they were animals, for the best of means, the best of intentions. Communism was again an idea for the improvement of human society. The goal of communism was that after the dictatorship of the proletariat and the overthrowing of the tyranny of the bourgeoisie and the rulers, human beings' life would change, they would become good, and as a result of the better behavior of human beings, the state would wither away. We wouldn't need to be governed. But communism didn't work. The state didn't wither away, it became stronger and stronger. Far from all being nice and happy together, we were killing one another to force one another to be good. So this is the 20th century has, as it were, brought out into the open the underlying errors that mankind was following as it emerged from the 19th century. And as the effects of the discoveries, the growth of science, spread to all the rest of the world, and the other nations began to rise up. Africa, out of its sleep of centuries, having been, as it were, plundered by the colonial powers, began to rise up, and it's still struggling out of its turmoil. The peoples in Europe underestimated this. They were thinking only of Europe and of the other countries as being sort of people that the Europeans looked after. You know, the reference to the white man's burden. That is, the Europeans were ahead of everybody. We would show everybody how to live properly. We would raise up everybody else to be nice Christians or whatever, and the world would be fine. And it was the outbreak, I think, of the First World War that really came as the great shock to mankind and undercut this whole optimism. Now, it wasn't only the First World War, because I think many people fought in the First World War with high ideals. My father fought in it. He was in the Battle of the Somme. And I know from talking with them, he quite sincerely believed that this was the war to end all wars. That after the war was over, people would look after the poor. That the soldiers who came back from the front would have work, could raise their families. That didn't happen. The war was followed by the great, that's right, in the 1930s. So the war was followed by great disillusionment. And what this book is really saying is, except that all this was happening, in other words, we had the Guardian speaks of two processes. The process of the rise of the order of Baha'u'llah and the process of the collapse of Western civilization. The collapse of Western civilization takes two forms. One is a degeneration of conditions and of behavior. Marian Hoffman, who you've certainly all heard of, and many of you may have known, was on pilgrimage talking to Shoghi Effendi at a time when he was describing to her the rise of the Baha'i World Commonwealth. How, as the faith spread in country after country, the numbers of Baha'is would increase. Eventually in some countries there would be so many Baha'is the government would accept the faith as the state religion. Then later other countries, the number of Baha'is would increase so much they would become Baha'i states. That the world would, in the meantime, have a world government, and eventually how the spirit of Baha'u'llah would permeate the world government and we would have a Baha'i World Commonwealth. And it's a wonderful vision, and he again and again spoke of this to the pilgrims and said, we should understand what this is about. In fact, when I was on pilgrimage, he went right back to Adam and described how everything was evolved from the time of Adam through all these religions on into 500,000 years hence. Then he said that was a bit too far to try to look beyond. But Marian said, but Shoghi Effendi, during this time, as you described it, large numbers of people will not become Baha'is. They will resist the faith. They will dislike the faith. What happens to all those people during this long period? And he said they will continue to decline morally and spiritually for the entire dispensation. Now that is the world we have to look at from one point of view. That we see conditions and behavior declining around us. We see what we think of as old standards being lost. We see extraordinary things being done. We shouldn't expect them suddenly to disappear. In other words, the world, in a sense, is going like this. But a second thing is happening to the rest of the world outside the Baha'i faith, and that is the progress of the greater plan of God. The moving of mankind into the lesser peace. So not all individual human beings are going to decline like this. There is going to be a breaking down of the barriers between human beings, a rise in the idealism that is spreading in the world, and an increase in the number of people that are working for the benefit of mankind. So you have the ones who are Baha'is, you have the ones who are rejecting the faith and going whoomp, and the ones who are, as it were, helping mankind move towards unity. And we have to remember also that the ones who are in the destructive direction are also helping to move towards unity, because they are usually destroying those things which divide human beings one from another. So that is what's happening in the world. This book really is to draw to our attention what happened in the faith in relation to the world during this 20th century. And this is really why Abdu'l-Baha would call the 20th century the century of light. In the 19th century, the faith came into being. Baha'u'llah taught, the Bab taught, he was martyred, Baha'u'llah left his message. But Baha'u'llah passed away just before the end of the 19th century. The faith had not become very widely known. It was temporarily in the time of the Bab, and then people lost interest again. But then it was just following the passing of Baha'u'llah and the services of Abdu'l-Baha that began the spread of the faith throughout the whole world, the rise, as it were, of the light of the faith in the East and the West. This began, of course, during the time of Baha'u'llah. We have a wonderful book by Abdu'l-Baha called The Secret of Divine Civilization. It's well worth reading. It's a book written by Abdu'l-Baha to the Persian people. And I think The Guardian refers to it as Abdu'l-Baha's greatest contribution to the organization of human society. It says many things in relation to Iran which are true of the whole world and is very pertinent to us now. He went to the West and proclaimed the unification of mankind. And I'll come back to that in a minute. In Persia, all sorts of things happened under the guidance of Abdu'l-Baha. The education of girls, the Baha'i schools developed under the guidance of Abdu'l-Baha. He helped the Persian society to move towards, it was not quite democracy, but heading in that direction, and had high hopes. But they didn't work out. The Shahs, who had the possibility of doing this, didn't do it. And so he knew when to step aside. Now, there was as much encouragement given by Abdu'l-Baha to those in Iran who were working for the constitutional movement, but then didn't pay any attention, so he just left that alone. But then there was the wonderful spread of the faith to Ashgabat, a really major Baha'i community, which had its schools, had its Mashraq al-Askar. It grew up, it shed its light, and then it was overwhelmed by the communist revolution in Russia, and the light faded out for the time being. But that was another outpouring of light. Abdu'l-Baha built the shrine of the Bab. It's incredible what he did in that short lifetime. Brought the remains of the Bab there and laid them in the shrine. He made the great public proclamation of the faith to the Western world. Now, we shouldn't forget that before he went to the Western world, he spent a year in Egypt. People often forget that. We think of him just going via Egypt to the West. But he spent a year in Egypt and had a profound effect on Sunni Islam, because the faith was born in Shia Islam. And Abdu'l-Baha had this effect on Sunni Islam, and there are all sorts of things that we can pick up now as the faith advances in relation to the Arab world and Islam, Sunni Islam, which will help us to raise our relationships with those parts of the world. The Baha'is in America, when they got to a certain point, urged Abdu'l-Baha to visit the West. And the time came when he could do it. This book describes Abdu'l-Baha's approach. His gentleness. He was very liberal in his presentation of the faith. He spoke to the people in the terms of the ideals they held and showed how they were possible of fulfillment. He encouraged them. He used generally logical proofs of the faith. Now, in the past, before that, very often the faith was taught simply by fulfillment of prophecy. By the time Abdu'l-Baha was in the West, most people couldn't care less about prophecy. And so he taught the faith based on logical proofs and taught us how to teach the faith. Again, the Guardian used to encourage us to read the reports of Abdu'l-Baha's talks in Promulgation of Universal Peace as an example of how to teach the faith nowadays. When he'd been in Egypt, he went first to London and then spent 2 months in Paris and went back to Alexandria, and finally sailed for the USA in 1912. One striking thing he did in the United States, in addition to this teaching of the faith and propounding the principles of the faith, and this is what's important, it's not just the details of what he taught, but he laid forth the principles of the faith in the Western world, was his proclamation of the covenant. He was able to find enough really devoted souls to proclaim to them the covenant of Baha'u'llah, and that he was the embodiment of that covenant. He could foresee the dangers the faith was facing and the vital importance of the covenant in protecting the faith and carrying it forward. He warned the Baha'is of crises to come in relation to the faith itself, and warned the world of the danger of the outbreak of the First World War. This was in 1913, was when he sailed from Marseilles on the way back to Haifa. He warned us about the war coming, and he foresaw it. We couldn't do anything to stop it. And then after the First World War was over, he warned of a second World War, even worse than the first, due to break out. So when you see the hope and the wonderful picture of the future, which Abdu'l-Baha portrays in his talks, in his writings, it was not through illusion. Abdu'l-Baha knew the world he was dealing with. But this is the aim for which we should, this goal for which we should aim. During the World War, say First World War, Abdu'l-Baha wrote the tablets of the Divine Plan. In other words, by his visit to the Western world, he found communities which were capable of carrying forward the teaching of the faith to the rest of the world. And these again, I don't know how many of you have read the tablets of the Divine Plan in detail. They're worth reading through as a block to see the details which Abdu'l-Baha included. You know, go to this part of the world and teach in this island, this island, this island, this island, or this island. All sorts of details on which the beloved Guardian built the 10-year crusade some years later. He spoke of the destiny of North America. This is another thing we should absorb very profoundly in relation both to our own Baha'i activities and to the conditions in the world. In the Kitab Aqdas, Baha'u'llah does two very interesting things, and in his other tablets. He speaks of the lesser peace, of calling upon the rulers of the world to establish the lesser peace. As they had rejected the most great peace, he said, have mercy on yourselves and those under you and hold fast to the lesser peace. In other words, he calls upon the government of the world, not the Baha'is, to establish a great agreement of nations which will be the lesser peace. In that same thing he indicates, and Baha'is often have the feeling the lesser peace is going to be blissful. You suddenly have the lesser peace and everything's happy, and many friends thought this would happen at the end of the 20th century. But Baha'u'llah says, if after this covenant is established, any country rises up and attacks another, all the others must unitedly arise and destroy that government. That's not peaceful. Baha'u'llah foresaw that the lesser peace would need to be upheld and thoroughly established after its first coming into being. Then he says another very interesting thing in his tablets. It's in the Aqdas again. He calls upon the presidents of the republics of America to uphold justice and to crush the tyrant who flourishes with the rod of the commandments of your Lord. Now, why would he address particularly the presidents of the Western Hemisphere? There's another link there, and that is the things that he wrote and that Abdu'l-Baha wrote about the natives of the Western Hemisphere, the Indian peoples, in other words, what we call Indians, whatever they are, Amerindians, native peoples, the First Nations. Throughout that whole part of the world, they have a destiny. They are coming newly, you might say, into the history of Asia and Europe and even Africa. So the Western Hemisphere has a very important function to perform in the pacification of the world, and, as we know, in the development of the faith. The United States in particular, but also Canada and the Latin American republics, have a particular destiny in the development of the faith. It was in America that the Guardian got the National Assembly to write the Declaration of Trust and Bylaws of National Assemblies. He built and established the administrative order there. He used to tell pilgrims that the faith was raised on two pillars, or he was raising the faith on two pillars. There was the pillars of the laws, which was raised in the East, in Iran, and the pillar of the principles, which was being raised in the West. And among the principles are the administrative principles. And among the administrative principles are the entire administrative order. And that he started in the West, and raised up in the West, and went over into the East. And the laws, which we find in the Aqdas and other writings of the faith, he began to establish in Iran, and then gradually have transferred to the West. So now we virtually have it all. The Aqdas is published. We are all struggling to work properly the administrative order. And this was all being founded by Abdu'l-Baha in his visits to the Western world. The passing of Abdu'l-Baha was the end of the apostolic age of the faith. And it's interesting that the faith, unlike other religions, had someone at the helm who could describe its history, show the meaning of the different stages to which it was going. We know we had an apostolic, a heroic age. What happened then and when it ended? And then the Guardian says we enter the formative age. This is the age we're now in, the building of the faith throughout the world. And then in time that will become the golden age. Abdu'l-Baha was a unique figure in the whole history of religions. We have of course, every manifestation of God was an exemplar, inevitably. He was divinely guided by God, and he showed mankind how to live. Each manifestation chose a different way to reveal himself. The Guardian used to say to the pilgrims that, for example, Jesus chose a very high rank. He spoke of himself as the Son of God, the Son of Man. He referred to God as my Father. He made clear there's a difference between the two. Someone addressed him as good master, and he says, don't call me good, no one's good but God. So there was a difference, but nevertheless Jesus was a reflection of God. You know, whoever hath seen me hath seen the Father. Nobody comes to the Father but by me. Now this of course is true of every manifestation of God, that no one comes to God except through the manifestation. But the pattern, the standard which Jesus chose was a very high one, and he concentrated on the individual behavior and the individual life, the individual salvation of every human being, rather than on society as a whole. Muhammad had the job of applying these principles to the whole of society, of raising up nations. And the Guardian explained Muhammad chose a very low station. That the Christians, of course, had made the mistake of deifying Jesus. It's a natural thing to do. That his light was so bright that they said, right, Jesus is God. God, there are three persons in God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And this, of course, is a very sad decision because it rules out the possibility of other revelations. Muhammad, trying to avoid this, chose a lower station. There was God and his messenger. To the degree that there's a lovely story of he in one of the battles, I think it was, he gave an instruction to his followers as to what they should do. And one of the principal followers said, is that your command or is it God's? They said, this is just mine. It's all right, and they disagreed with him. This was the relationship between Muhammad and his followers. We shouldn't underestimate Muhammad from the West, by the way. There's a lovely film called The Message, which you should see if you can, about Muhammad and his years. We know so little about him in faith, but nevertheless, he wanted to emphasize the unity of God. So he as a manifestation, lowered the status of the manifestations to stress this one central point. Now, with Baha'u'llah and the Bab, we can have the two together. We understand what is meant by the manifestation speaking as God, but the manifestation not being the essence of God. It's quite a complex theological understanding. But this again, the Muslims, of course, have misunderstood what Muhammad said about the seal of the prophets. Again, they've shut off history after the coming of Muhammad. The uniqueness of Abdu'l-Baha is that he is clearly not a manifestation of God, but he is a perfect human being. He was able to show us how a perfect Baha'i can live. And now this is wonderful because he isn't the manifestation of God, so he's not in that same status. He is like a human being. Now, I don't think any of us will ever achieve the standard of obedience of Abdu'l-Baha. But as he said, the proper station of all human beings is that of servants. The station of servitude is the proper human status. We should all be servants. Servants of one another, servants of mankind, servants of God. And he showed us how to be a servant. When in preparation for his passing away, he wrote his will and testament. And in this marvelous document, he took the laws of the Aqdas, he took what Baha'u'llah had created and related all the parts together. He confirmed the successorship in the faith of the guardianship and the universal house of justice. He showed how the hands of the cause fitted into the picture. He did so many things in this wonderful document. It's worth reading very, very carefully, which is a light for the whole future of the faith. The Guardian says we wouldn't really be able to understand the implications of the Will and Testament until we had 100 years, 100 years of its working. Because it's in working it that we begin to really to understand it. So Abdu'l-Baha's Will and Testament set in motion a whole new development in the faith. And was followed, of course, by the ministry of Shoghi Effendi. Let's see if I can find a passage here I wanted to read. Oh, yes. Now, the situation when Shoghi Effendi became guardian, of course, was a very precarious one for the faith. The faith, in fact, had been suppressed in the East and was until then virtually ignored in the West. We had a wonderful results from Abdu'l-Baha's visits to the West, but they were not really what he'd hoped for. We look back and we see the effect, but he had hoped for much more. When Shoghi Effendi became guardian, he had hoped to establish international institutions. He had to start virtually alone. He was a young man, 23 was it? And it was an incredible shock to him to be made the guardian. And he'd expected to be helped by his family. It was natural. Here he was, grandson of Abdu'l-Baha. He had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, various cousins, all grandchildren of Abdu'l-Baha. Naturally, he would expect them to obey the will and to help him. But alas, gradually, they defected. One by one, they criticized him, turned against him, and betrayed him. Khanim says at one time the guardian was so alone that the only person he had to consult with was his cook. The baha'i who was the cook in the house. He was the only faithful person he could find to talk to. He tried to establish the Universal House of Justice. He got some baha'is to come together and they consulted with the idea of establishing the House of Justice. But he knew it was too soon. The world wasn't yet ready for it. He had to establish the administrative order first. And with the support of the Greatest Holy Relief, he gathered the communities together. You read his wonderful letters in the administration, Baha'i administration, of what he did with the communities in those early years of the guardianship. In his writings, the passage I want to read here, that's what I was getting. In his writings, he showed us the principle of the oneness of mankind. Page 50. Yeah. Now, the writings of the Guardian are not the easiest to read. But I think we really should understand that literacy is not just something we expect primitive people to have. The pilgrims used to sometimes complain to the Guardian that his language was a bit exalted for people to read. And he said, English is a wonderful language, why shouldn't he use it in all it can do? And the believers had to learn how to understand it. And I think we should remember that. He wasn't trying to be difficult. And you get a misimpression sometimes by thinking the Guardian's language is flowery. In other words, it's embroidered. It isn't. The Guardian's language is extremely concise. He's condensed into one paragraph what would normally take 3 or 4 pages. And that's why it's so intense. And he said what he meant. If you asked the Guardian about one word that he used somewhere, he could tell you why he meant that word, not some other word. Now in this particular passage, he says, the unity of the human race as envisaged by Baha'u'llah implies the establishment of a world commonwealth in which all nations, races, creeds and classes are closely and permanently united, and in which the autonomy of its state members and the personal freedom and initiative of the individuals that compose them are definitely and completely safeguarded. This commonwealth must, as far as we can visualize it, consist of a world legislature whose members will, as the trustees of the whole of mankind, ultimately control the entire resources of all the component nations, and will enact such laws as shall be required to regulate the life, satisfy the needs, and adjust the relationships of all races and peoples. A world executive backed by an international force will carry out the decisions arrived at and apply the laws enacted by this world legislature, and will safeguard the organic unity of the whole Commonwealth. A world tribunal will adjudicate and deliver its compulsory and final verdict on all and any disputes that may arise between the various elements constituting this universal system. The economic resources of the world will be organized. Its sources of raw materials will be tapped and fully utilized. Its markets will be coordinated and developed, and the distribution of its products will be equitably regulated. Now, it's interesting, you see, he says here, as far as we can envisage. Even he is outlining a pattern that will evolve, not giving specific details. Then, having built the administrative order, the Guardian implemented the divine plan. And there's a very important quotation in section 6 of this book, which I'll now read. Page 6. This is a description of the station to which, in this case, the North American believers, but I believe all believers, are called. And it's worth reading and rereading. It says, by the sublimity and serenity of their faith, by the steadiness and clarity of their vision, the incorruptibility of their character, the rigor of their discipline, the sanctity of their morals, and the unique example of their community life, they can and indeed must, in a world populated with its incurable corruption, in a world polluted with its incurable corruptions, paralyzed by its haunting fears, torn by its devastating hatreds, and languishing under the weight of its appalling miseries, demonstrate the validity of their claim to be regarded as the sole repository of that grace upon whose operation must depend the complete deliverance, the fundamental reorganization, and the supreme felicity of all mankind. Now, I want to read that again because I think it's an extremely important passage. It gives us an idea not only of the standard we have to rise to, but of what's dependent upon us and of the effect that we're called upon to have on the rest of the world. He says, by the sublimity and serenity of their faith, by the steadiness and clarity of their vision, the incorruptibility of their character, the rigor of their discipline, the sanctity of their morals, and the unique example of their community life, they can and indeed must, in a world polluted with its incurable corruptions, paralyzed by its haunting fears, torn by its devastating hatreds, and languishing under the weight of its appalling miseries, demonstrate the validity of their claim to be regarded as the sole repository of that grace upon whose operation must depend the complete deliverance, the fundamental reorganization, and the supreme felicity of all mankind. Now, we can't obviously, as Baha'is, go around to our non-Baha'i neighbors and tell them that, look, we're this sort of people. That's his point. But it relates to this status or station of the Baha'i community as being a proof of the truth of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. Now, in the Promise of World Peace, the House of Justice offers the Baha'i community as an example of how human beings can work peacefully together. It's already been done, the offer has been made. And in place after place, people are waking up to this fact and are admiring the function of the Baha'i community in this way, and are beginning to take lessons from Baha'is in this way of operating, of consultation and so on. But it affects us in every way: our personal lives, our relationship with other people, because every Baha'i is looked upon as an example of the faith, a sample of the faith, you might say. If we begin to cheat anybody, they say, oh, the Baha'is are just like anybody else. Anything we do has an effect on this, on the whole future of mankind. And people watch us. One learns this very much if one lives in Haifa, because start with, you learn after a while that people are watching us, they know you're Baha'is. There was a lovely story, which fortunately is a nice story, of a time when the American fleet was in harbour in Haifa, and a lot of the sailors came on shore and behaved as sailors on shore often will do. Though they were pretty good on the whole, they were honest and nice people, but a lot of the more conservative Israelis got rather agitated. And there was a group of American sailors up in the Merkaz on Mount Carmel one day, and the Baha'i passing by, I think he was a security guard, but he was working the faith, and he was an American too, and looked like an American. And this Israeli was upbraiding these sailors, saying, "You sailors, you come here, you misbehave with our girls, you swear, you drink," tearing strips off them. And they were rather taken aback. And he suddenly turned to this passing Baha'i and said, "Not you, you're a Baha'i, you're good." And then, and then turned back to blasting these poor sailors. But of course the Baha'i was astonished. How did he know he's a Baha'i? Why should he have suddenly made this exception? He must have known somehow or other. And you find that as you're living in Haifa, that people know, and I think you find more and more in our own society here, Baha'is will get known. People may not always say something, but what we do reflects the whole work of the faith. Now, what did the Guardian do in this way of raising up the faith? And this is part of this light of this century. To start with, there's his letters, pouring them out, year after year after year. And it's worth reading even the early letters now. They all show the care of the Guardian for the communities. There are so many of them, you can't read them all, but at least the published World Order letters, for example, the Advent of Divine Justice, the Promised Day has come, and of course God Passes By, which is his commentary, you might say, on the history of the faith up to 1944. And lets us see, really, from a God's eye view, what was taking place in the world. We can find out from any history who went where and what physical thing happened. But what was the significance of it in the history of mankind? We find that out from God Passes By. Then there were the teaching plans he called us to. The first 7-year plan, the second 7-year plan, the 10-year crusade, the intermediate plans that came into being with the second 7-year plan, the British 6-year plan, for example, and the 2-year plan in Africa. All these the Guardian used to guide the believers. And we were a very small community. I remember when the 6-year plan ended, the community was so delighted, because it was a big job. It was raising 5 local assemblies up to 24. 19 new local assemblies in that period. And the community didn't really get going till about 3 years through the plan. But then it got going. And I think the percentage of Baha'is in the British community who pioneered, this is home front pioneering, of course, but what else? During the 6-year plan, eclipsed any other pioneer records in the world. And the Guardian was thrilled to bits with the functioning of the British Baha'i community at that time. So the end of the plan came, and everybody was very happy. And lo and behold, we get the Guardian calling upon the British Baha'is to go to Africa. and open up centres in East and West Africa. Now, people didn't know much about Africa in those days. I went to a map shop in London. I've forgotten the name of the street, but it sold maps. It was a famous map shop. And I wanted to buy a map of Kenya. So I said to the girl, could I have a map of Kenya, please? She said, oh, yes, sir. And she went to look at the thing, and that's in Africa, isn't it? So she eventually found the map and gave it to me. But people didn't know much about the world. Dear Claire Gung, who earned the title from The Guardian of the Mother of Africa, was a German Baha'i who came to Britain, and she was so seasick getting here, she promised herself that she would never leave the country once she was here. She wasn't getting any more seasickness. She sailed to Africa and established a faith in East Africa. So this 2-year plan was then a new departure, because he called in other national assemblies and had several assemblies working together. And when you look back and realize what happened afterwards, you see the wisdom and the essential guidance given by just having this 2-year plan and the assemblies collaborating. As a result of the World War II, all sorts of certainties in the world went by the board. And The Guardian comments on this in here, page 71. No, sorry, this isn't The Guardian commenting, it's the book commenting. Yeah, this is talking about the Guardian's prophetic statements about the development of the world. It says, the entry into the war by the United States, whose president had initiated the project of a system of international order, but which had itself rejected this visionary initiative, that was President Wilson in the League of Nations, would lead that nation, Shoghi Effendi predicted, and this is his prediction, to assume through adversity its preponderating share of responsibility to lay down once for all broad, worldwide, unassailable foundations of that discredited yet immortal system. Now, the function of the United States in establishing the basis of an international system, which is, of course, the United Nations. Now, it says, these statements proved prophetic. This is back to the book. With the end of hostilities, it gradually became apparent that a fundamental shift in consciousness was underway throughout the world, and that inherited assumptions, institutions, and priorities that had been progressively undermined by forces at work during the first half of the century were now crumbling. If the change could not yet be described as an emerging conviction about the oneness of humankind, no objective observer could mistake the fact that barriers blocking such a realization, which had survived all the assaults against them earlier in the century, were at last giving way. So remember I spoke of the rigidity it is at the end of the 19th century and the breakdown of things in the First World War. This is the real crumbling of the trouble. One's mind turns to the prophetic words of the Quran, and you see the mountains and think them solid, but they shall pass away as the passing away of the clouds. The effect was to inspire in progressive minds a sense of confidence that it would be possible to construct a new kind of society that would not only preserve the long-term peace of the world, but enrich the lives of all its inhabitants. And this, of course, relates to that second part of what's happening with the non-Baha'is that I mentioned at the very beginning, the building up of international institutions, the United Nations and all its dependent agencies. What the United Nations has not always been successful in is enforcing peace. There have been two major events that have been worth thinking about from this point of view. One, of course, was the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. I think it's the first time when one country attacked another that the other country said, no, go back or we'll clobber you. And he didn't go back, and the other nations clobbered Iraq. Now, they partly clobbered it. You see, the Baha'u'llah's statement is of one nation, but this was, of course, Baha'u'llah's context is that they've got the lesser peace established. We haven't yet got the lesser peace established. We're sort of urging ourselves in that direction. But it's still the idea that one country just isn't allowed to go and attack another by itself. So the other countries attacked Iraq, drove it back, and demanded certain conditions. What then happened was that the United Nations had a sort of loss of will, you might say, because for 12 years they patiently waited for Iraq to do what it was told to do, and it didn't. And then you had this second Gulf War, with the enforcement of peace undertaken not by the United Nations but by the President of America. You see what I mean earlier by saying Baha'u'llah called upon two different things? Now, I'm not saying America was right to invade Iraq in the Second Gulf War, but it's the sort of thing that I think Baha'u'llah was thinking about. If the world nations as a body together cannot enforce peace, if you conquer a country that has been aggressing and required conditions to put itself right again that doesn't meet the conditions, then you should go in again and make it do what it's told. Now, so we've got awful troubles now in Iraq, and America has awful troubles, but we're learning the sort of troubles mankind is going to have to deal with. Maybe that was the wrong way of dealing with it. Maybe it was a mistake to invade Iraq at that time. We don't know. We should never know, because we don't know what would have happened if something else had been done. I'm giving these examples because this is all part of what we call the century of light. And of course, war is a dark thing. But we must see how it's mankind groping towards the establishment of discipline in the world. Other things have happened. One was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was a thing that would have been unthinkable before the Second World War. That the world authority would have laid down universal rights which all governments must obey. Now, we still don't do it very well. We have all sorts of problems with the upholding of human rights in the world, but it's moving in that direction. The process has started. There were the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War. This again is a thing that many people regard as, in fact, as basically illegal, and I think probably it was. The trial of people of a country for what were regarded as offences against the whole of mankind. That had never happened before. There were quite a number of the Germans who were accused said, but I was obeying orders. And that was always used to be the excuse. A soldier did what he was instructed. But now mankind is saying, yes, but there are some things you don't obey orders for. There are some things which are universal human standards which you don't do. And of course, the thing that was regarded as illegal, they then punished retroactively people who committed these crimes. And normally, again, in most human law, systems of law, you don't retroactively apply a law. It's unjust. So on the surface of it, it looked unjust, but it was a tremendous step forward in mankind's attitude to human behavior. That there are some offences you cannot excuse by saying that you're fighting for your country or your government instructed you to do it. It's interesting because Richard III in England was killed, and a lot of people who supported him were clobbered by Henry VII rather, and the barons quietly after that. Because Henry VII had said Richard III was a usurper and therefore the people should be punished. After that, got him to make a law that no one could be punished for obeying the instructions of a person who at that time was his lawful sovereign. They couldn't defend themselves against Henry VII, but they got nasty in the law that henceforth, if we do what the king tells us, nobody's going to punish us afterwards. That's the opposite of Nuremberg. It's the standard which was usually adopted. Because if you can get punished by anybody who comes along afterwards, you're in trouble. That's why we're still working. I think mankind is working out the implications of the Nuremberg trials and what it means for the future. What is genocide? How do you define it? what are things which soldiers should not obey, that changes totally the idea of an army. I mean, everybody used to think it very funny that the Swedish army could go on strike. But it does, and Sweden seems to survive. There are new ideas opening up. This, I think, is what he was meaning by the crumbling of these old standards. Some of the crumbling is unpleasant for all the different countries. I wonder if that's the best place for me to pause now. Wait a minute. These are the things that were happening in the world, which were showing that the crumbling, as I say, of the rigid standards of the past, which were preventing the evolution of world unity. In the faith itself, of course, the Guardian also developed the administration in one very important new way. And this was the appointment of hands of the cause of God, and the instruction to the hands to appoint auxiliary board members. You see, in the beginning, all that Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha could really do was to use good, devoted Baha'is to carry out their instructions. They initiated for a while the certain consultative bodies. Abdu'l-Baha, for example, started the local assembly of Tehran, and he said that the hands should be members of it. But what had happened in the West was that they had these great Baha'is who were sort of running the show, because they were the only people willing to do it. And the institution of the local assemblies and the national assemblies was a shift from individual authority, even the moral authority, towards institutional authority. And the Baha'is had just learned that, and were getting nice and comfortable dealing with assemblies, local assemblies and national assemblies. Suddenly the Guardian appoints hands of the cause of God. And here you have a strange character. You have someone who has no priestly authority. There are no sacraments in the faith to function with. They didn't marry people. They have no governing authority. They can't rule the communities or give, shall we say, executive instructions to the Baha'is. They have a moral authority, and a very high moral authority. And it took a long time for the Baha'is to cotton onto this. What is this moral authority of the hands of the cause of God? The American National Assembly, in all innocence, in fact, its national report was written by Horace Holly, who was a hand of the cause himself. It published its annual report, and it placed the report of the hands of the cause among the reports of the national committees. And the Guardian was furious. He said they should go down on their knees before the hands of the cause of God. Don't they know who they are? So it's a very interesting thing. Here you have the hands of the cause as individuals in the faith who have tremendous responsibility and great moral authority, but no, shall we say, legal instructive authority. They can consult national assemblies, they urge national assemblies, they advise national assemblies. National assemblies have to pay great attention to what they say. But the National Assembly also had the duty to consult upon what they said, and if necessary, decide the opposite. And that's a difficult concept. And it's taken the Baha'is quite a long while to work this out. But it's a very important thing for the faith, because you have now these two arms. One, an elected arm building up towards the House of Justice, which was responsible for the actual administration of the faith. The other, individuals appointed by the World Centre of the Faith with its authority going downwards. So in those days the hands, now the councillors and the auxiliary board members, who are, as we're beginning to see now, absolutely invaluable in the work of the faith. The things they can do, they act as individuals. The Guardian said ultimately all the teaching of the faith is under the guidance of this appointed arm, because the assemblies will be so busy administering the Baha'i communities. They'll be so big. I mean, they're dealing with all sorts of things, including the running of the railways and the taxes and harvesting, everything in the community. The assemblies will be running. But the work of the teaching work and the defense of the faith will be in the hands of people who do not have administrative authority. They don't act in the way that assemblies do. It's a complex thought. But this is another light, you may say, that the Guardian gave to the community. He'd only just given it not long before he passed away. Because that's the point at which I think I'm to stop tonight. It was the passing of Shoghi Effendi. Because everyone was so devoted to Shoghi Effendi, and he was still a young man, 61 I think he was, and seemed very vigorous. But he was being absolutely bowed down by his work. Someone once said to Rahir Khanum, was it the failure of the Baha'is to do what he wanted them to do that caused him to his heart to break? And he said no. She said it was the covenant breakers, and what they had done to him all these years just wore him away. And we should remember this when we hear people called covenant breakers, and we should understand what they've done in the lives of the centers of the faith. One example is in the case of Abdul Baha when he traveled to the West. There was I think this man was a nephew of Abdul Baha's wife, Dr. Farid. He traveled with Abdul Baha. And one of the things, he was always doing strange things. One thing he did, he went quietly to a wealthy Baha'i and pointed out that Abdul Baha wasn't accepting any gifts because it wasn't really appropriate for him to do so, but really it would be very helpful to him if she could give him some money to do all the things he had to do. This was a terrible test for this Baha'i, and was a shame, of course, for Abdul Baha. Abdul Baha would never have permitted anyone to do such a thing. And when he went back, got back to Haifa, Rahir Khanum said that he came into the master's house. He walked up the stairs into the house and went straight to the room of Munira Khanum and said to her, "Farid has ground me up." So that's the effect of one man with his personal shortcomings. By then he hadn't become a covenant breaker. He just, while still apparently a true Baha'i, he just kept doing things which were, as it were, causing endless trouble for Abdul Baha. Then he broke the covenant in due course. But I mention this because it's an aspect of this whole situation which we have to bear in mind when we're discussing this century of light. And I think it's a good place to break now for the passing of Shoghi Effendi. Then we can go on for the development after that, the rest of the 20th century. Thank you.